Welcome back. In the previous chapter, we talked about how the labor supply curve represents workers' decisions to work and how much they want to work. We saw how changes in wages, non-labor income, and taxes could influence their decisions. And now we're going to move to the other side of the equation, to firms and their decisions. So we'll build the labor demand curve for the entire industry based on each individual firm and see how changes influence firms' decision-making process. So firms don't simply want to see warm bodies around the office or in the plant. They also don't hire their people for their sunny disposition or their sense of humor. The goal of hiring workers is to increase the firm's profitability. Consumers want to purchase goods and services, and firms hire people so that they can provide those goods and services to consumers, earning themselves some money in the process. The firm's labor demand is not quite the same as consumer demand. Consumer demand is determined by their own wants and needs. On the other hand, firms' demand for labor is called derived demand. That's because their labor demand is determined by how many people want to buy their product. There's nothing inherent in the firm for their decision-making to decide how many people to hire. Without people wanting to buy the firm's products, they would not hire any workers because the firm wouldn't exist because they're not selling anything. The demand for goods and services are similar to labor demand. However, there's some key differences that are worth discussing in detail. So that's how we're going to begin this lecture. To really understand what drives a firm's labor demand, we're going to dig into the firm's production function. Now, this is not the most exciting thing in the world, and there will be several graphs. I do apologize for that, but these are necessary in order to understand why firms are willing to pay certain wages, but not higher wages. So we're going to need to understand the internal workings of the firm. The firm's production function is a term that we use. Basically, it's a mathematical way to represent how firms turn inputs into goods and services. These inputs include raw materials, products that are being produced by other firms, physical capital like machines, and of course, workers, which we're concerned about in this chapter. Now, since this is a model, again, like we've been talking about since the beginning of the course, we are going to be simplifying things. Now, it may not mean things are perfectly realistic, but if we simplify the right things, we can make it so the model is easy enough to work with while still illuminating what's happening in the real world. So in this case, we're going to assume there's only two factors involved in production. In reality, there's many more. But for our analysis, we only really care about workers and then the capital they use in the production process. Firms have a number of options of capital and labor available to them. So they face a choice. Excuse me. How much of capital and how much of labor to choose that will maximize their profits. So by breaking down a firm's product into a simple equation, we can start to get at this. So let's begin with Q, or the firm's total output, as a function of employee hours and capital. Now, throughout the analysis, we will just call E employees, but the hours they work do matter. In this case, we're just assuming that each employee works the same amount of hours. Now, remember, marginal just means the next unit. So the marginal product of labor is the change in output resulting from an additional unit of labor, holding all the other inputs constant. For our model, an additional unit of labor is hiring another worker. We can say that the marginal product of labor is the resulting output from hiring one additional worker without making any changes to the amount of capital that we're using. The marginal product of capital is the change in output resulting from employing one additional unit of capital, whatever that unit is, holding constant the quantities of other inputs like workers.